"Take that off, Granny. You're a disgrace to that uniform," Judge Miller roared, pointing at the 72-year-old woman's silver star. He thought Martha was a fraud, a random grandmother wearing a fake medal for sympathy. But as the bailiff moved to grab her, the courtroom door slammed open. A 4-star general marched in, snapped his heels, and gave Martha a crisp salute. "Touch that medal, Your Honor," the general growled, "and you'll be answering to the Pentagon." Who exactly was this random granny? The town of Oak Ridge was the kind of place where history felt like it had stopped moving 40 years ago. It was a place of quiet porches, Sunday bells, and secrets kept behind white picket fences. At the heart of this silence lived Martha Jenkins. To the local mailman, she was just the woman who grew the best tomatoes in the county. To the kids on the street, she was the granny who always had a jar of peppermint candies ready. But Martha lived a life of deliberate invisibility. She never talked about where she came from before moving to the valley in the late 80s, and she certainly never talked about the military. The trouble started when a massive land development firm, Apex Horizon, decided that Martha's small 3-acre property was the perfect spot for a luxury resort's entrance. They offered her money, more money than she had seen in her entire life. But Martha didn't even look at the check. That land held a small, unmarked stone under a willow tree, and she had promised a dying man 50 years ago that she would never let that ground be disturbed. When the developers realized Martha couldn't be bought, they decided to break her. They used their political weight to dig up irregularities in her property deed. They claimed her late father hadn't signed the transfer papers correctly in 1954. It was a lie, a legal maneuver designed to drag an old woman into a court where she had no hope of winning. The day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom felt more like an execution chamber. The developer, Marcus Thorne, sat at the front with 4 lawyers, all wearing suits that cost more than Martha's house. On the bench sat Judge Miller, a man whose reputation for being tough on crime was actually a cover for his loyalty to the town's elite. He looked at Martha with a mixture of boredom and irritation. Martha walked into the room, and for the first time in 30 years, she wasn't wearing her floral dress. She was wearing an old olive-drab field jacket. It was clean, pressed, and smelled of cedar and old memories. And pinned to the left side, right over her heart, was a silver star. The room went silent. In a military town like this, everyone knew what that medal meant. It was the 3rd highest award for valor in the U.S. Armed Forces. But seeing it on a woman like Martha, someone the records showed had only served as a clerk-typist, felt like a joke to those in power. "Miss Jenkins," Judge Miller began, his voice echoing off the high ceilings, "we are here to discuss a property dispute, not to put on a costume party. Why are you wearing that?" Martha stood at the podium, her hands clasped in front of her. She didn't look like a victim, she looked like a soldier standing at attention. "It's a day of significance, Your Honor. I wore it to remind myself of what I'm fighting for." Miller leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "That medal is for gallantry in action. My clerks did a background check on your service record this morning. It says you were stationed in a logistics office in 1974. You were a secretary, Martha. Secretaries don't get silver stars. Stolen valor is a serious crime in my court. It's an insult to the men who actually bled for this country." Marcus Thorne, the developer, let out a loud, mocking chuckle. "Maybe she found it at a garage sale, Your Honor," he whispered, loud enough for the whole room to hear. The judge's face turned a deep, angry purple. He felt that Martha was trying to manipulate his emotions, to use a fake history to get mercy for her land. "I'm going to give you one chance, Miss Jenkins. Take that medal off right now. If you don't, I will hold you in contempt. I will have the bailiff seize that stolen property, and I will ensure you spend the night in a cell before we even talk about your house." Martha didn't move. She thought about the sandstorms of the Mojave. She thought about the secret Black Ops missions that were never written into the official history books. She thought about the clerk title that was actually a cover for the most elite extraction team in the Cold War era. She knew her records were scrubbed for a reason. "I cannot take it off, Your Honor," Martha said, her voice like iron, "because I didn't find it. I earned it in a place you aren't even allowed to know exists." That was the final straw. Miller slammed his gavel so hard the wood nearly cracked. "Bailiff, remove that woman's jacket! Seize the medal!" The bailiff, a young man who looked uncomfortable, began to walk toward Martha. She closed her eyes, bracing for the humiliation. But then a sound vibrated through the floorboards, a heavy, rhythmic thud, the sound of high-ranking authority. The double doors at the back of the room didn't just open, they were thrown back with such force they hit the walls. Standing there was a man who looked like he was carved out of granite. 4 silver stars glinted on each of his shoulders. Behind him were 2 MPs in full gear. The entire courtroom gasped. This wasn't a local colonel or a retired vet. This was General Samuel Reed, the man who commanded the entire Special Operations Network of the United States. He didn't wait to be invited. He marched down the center aisle, his eyes locked on Martha. As he reached her, the general didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at the lawyers. He stopped, stood perfectly still, and brought his hand to his brow in a razor-sharp salute. "Special Agent Jenkins," the general said, his voice booming like a cannon. "Reporting as ordered." The judge's gavel fell from his hand, clattering onto the floor. The silence was so heavy you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. The random granny wasn't a secretary, and the story of why a 4-star general would risk his career to save her was about to turn this courtroom into an international headline. The courtroom felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of it. Judge Miller sat frozen, his mouth slightly agape, staring at the 4 silver stars on General Reed's shoulders. In the United States military, a 4-star general is a position of near-mythic authority, usually found in the Pentagon or commanding entire theaters of war, not in a small-town property court in Oak Ridge. The bailiff, who only moments ago had been reaching for Martha's jacket, took 3 steps back, his face pale. He knew enough to know that you do not interfere with a man flanked by armed military police. General Reed slowly lowered his salute, but his posture remained as rigid as a steel beam. He turned his gaze toward the bench. It wasn't a look of curiosity. It was a look of absolute, cold command. "Your Honor," the general's voice resonated, vibrating the wooden banisters of the gallery. "I believe there has been a profound misunderstanding in this room. I was informed that a member of my former unit was being threatened with the seizure of her property and the desecration of her uniform." Judge Miller cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of his lost dignity. He adjusted his robes, though his hands were visibly shaking. "General Reed, is it? I respect your rank, sir, but this is a civil court. This woman, Martha Jenkins, is wearing a silver star. My research, official government records, show she was a clerk-typist, a secretary. She is in violation of the Stolen Valor Act, and I was simply—" "Your research," the general interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "is based on the public record, the record we created to keep this woman alive for the last 40 years. The general reached into the hands of one of the MPs and took a thick tan folder. Across the front, stamped in bold, bleeding red ink, were the words, "Top Secret, EOD Honor, Classified." He walked toward the bench and slammed the folder down in front of the judge. The sound was like a gunshot. "Open it," Reed commanded. Miller hesitated, then slowly opened the file. His eyes began to scan the documents. As he read, the color drained from his face until he looked like a ghost. He saw photos, Not of a grandmother in a garden, but of a young woman in tactical gear, standing in front of a downed helicopter in a jungle that didn't exist on any map. He saw commendations signed by 3 different presidents, all of them redacted to the point of being nearly blacked out, except for the name, Martha the Ghost Jenkins. In 1972, the general began, addressing the entire room now, the world believed Martha Jenkins was typing memos in a basement in Virginia. In reality, she was the primary extraction specialist for a unit so secret that its name is still a federal crime to utter. She wasn't a secretary. She was the person we sent in when official soldiers were too high profile to exist. The general pointed at the silver star on Martha's chest. She didn't get that for clerical work, Judge. She got that for crawling through 2 miles of enemy-occupied territory with a shattered femur to drag my bleeding body out of a kill zone. She saved a future general, a future senator, and 3 other men who were currently high-ranking officials in the intelligence community. She is the reason I am standing here today. And she was told she could never tell a soul, not her neighbors, not her family, not even her government. The developer, Marcus Thorne, tried to speak. Now hold on, this is still a property dispute. The deed is... The general turned on Thorne with a look that could melt lead. Mr. Thorne, I've spent the last 6 hours looking into your Apex Horizon company. I found 3 offshore accounts and a trail of bribery that leads directly to this courthouse. If you so much as breathe in Ms. Jenkins' direction again, I won't just take your land, I will dismantle your entire life. Thorne slumped back into his chair, suddenly looking very small. Judge Miller looked back at the file, then at Martha. He realized the gravity of his mistake. He hadn't just insulted an old woman, he had insulted a living legend of the United States Shadow Wars. "General," Miller stammered, "I didn't know. The records were so clear." "That was the point, Your Honor," Martha said, speaking for the first time since the general entered. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of a veteran who had seen too much. "We were ghosts. We did the jobs nobody else would do, and our reward was a life of silence. I didn't wear this medal to trick you. I wore it because today I felt like I was being erased again. And I've worked too hard for this country to be erased by a shopping mall." The general stepped beside Martha and placed a hand on her shoulder. "The silence ends today, Martha. I've spoken with the Secretary of Defense. Your file is being partially declassified. The world is going to know exactly who you are." But as the general spoke those words, a look of genuine fear crossed Martha's face. She knew something the general didn't. She knew that the reason her file was classified wasn't just to protect her. It was to protect the world from a secret she had carried out of the desert 50 years ago. A secret that was buried right under that willow tree on her disputed land. "Sam," Martha whispered to the general, "you don't understand. If they dig up that land, if Thorne's bulldozers hit that spot, it's not just about a grave. It's about what we brought back from the mission in '74. The general's expression shifted from protective to deeply concerned. The courtroom was still, but the real storm was just beginning. The courtroom fell into a secondary, deeper silence as Martha's whisper echoed in General Reed's ear. The general's face, usually an unreadable mask of military discipline, flickered with a shadow of old, buried fear. He looked at Martha, really looked at her, and saw not just the woman who had saved his life, but the guardian of a secret that had kept the world's superpowers at bay for 5 decades. "Your Honor," the general said, his voice suddenly sharp and official, "this court is now under a national security stay. Everyone except the defendant, her counsel, and essential personnel are to vacate the room immediately." The protest from Marcus Thorne was silenced by a single look from the armed MPs. Within minutes, the heavy doors were locked from the inside. The random granny stood at the center of a room that had become a makeshift command center. To understand why a piece of land in Oak Ridge was worth risking a 4-star career, we have to go back to June 1974. The world knew 1974 as a year of political scandal and the tail end of the Vietnam War. But in the high-altitude deserts of the Middle East, a different kind of war was being fought. A war for the asset. Martha Jenkins, then 24 years old, was officially a junior admin at a quiet base in Nevada. In reality, she was the most gifted pilot and extraction artist in a unit codenamed EOD Honor. Her specialty wasn't just flying, it was disappearing. She could land a transport plane on a dime in a sandstorm and take off before the enemy even knew the wind had changed. The mission was simple on paper: retrieve a downed experimental satellite that had crashed in a disputed no-man's land between borders. The satellite contained a prototype encryption device that, if captured, would render every American nuclear silo vulnerable. The team, led by a young Captain Samuel Reed, had dropped in under the cover of a lunar eclipse, but as they reached the crash site, they realized the intelligence was wrong. It wasn't a satellite. Martha whispered, her eyes staring at the courtroom floor as if the wood were turning into desert sand. No markings, no country of origin, and it wasn't broken. It was open. In the flashback, we see the young Martha Jenkins holding a perimeter with a CAR-15 rifle. The heat was 120 degrees. The air tasted like ozone and copper. As Reed and his men approached the object, a low-frequency hum began to vibrate through their bones. It wasn't tech they recognized. It was something else. But they weren't alone. An elite mercenary group hired by a shadow organization had tracked the signal. A firefight erupted, a brutal, chaotic scramble in the dark. This was where Martha earned the Silver Star. When the mercenary team launched a mortar that flipped the unit's only extraction vehicle, pinning Reed underneath, the rest of the team took cover. Not Martha. She didn't wait for orders. She drove a damaged, burning scout jeep directly into the line of fire, using the vehicle as a moving shield. She jumped out while the jeep was still rolling, tied a winch to the wreckage, pinning Reed, and dragged him clear while bullets shredded her jacket. She was hit twice, once in the leg, once in the shoulder, but she never slowed down. "We couldn't leave the cylinder," Reed added, his voice low. "The orders were clear: recover or destroy. But we couldn't destroy it. Explosives didn't even scratch the surface." They managed to haul the object onto the last remaining transport plane. Martha, bleeding and drifting in and out of consciousness, flew that plane through a canyon so narrow the wings clipped the rock faces. They made it to international waters, but the asset was changing. The men who had touched it were getting sick. The electronics on the ship started failing. When they landed back on U.S. soil, the Pentagon didn't want the asset in a government lab. They realized that anyone who held it became a target for every intelligence agency on the planet. They needed it to disappear completely. Martha, the woman who had no family and lived for the shadows, made an offer. "Give me a piece of land," she had told the generals in 1974. "Somewhere quiet, somewhere nobody would ever look. I'll watch it. I'll be the ghost in the garden." They gave her the land in Oak Ridge. They scrubbed her files, turning her into a secretary. They buried the cylinder 40 feet deep right under the willow tree and built the house over it. Martha Jenkins wasn't just living on that land. She was sitting on a ticking bomb of global proportions. Back in the courtroom, Martha looked at the judge, who was now trembling. "Your Honor," Martha said, "that property dispute isn't about land. Marcus Thorne isn't a developer. If you look at his backers, you'll find the descendants of the men who tried to kill us in that desert. They've been looking for that cylinder for 50 years. They used your court to find the one place the Pentagon tried to hide. The general's phone buzzed. He looked at it, his face turning pale. The satellite feed just went live. Thorne's construction crew isn't waiting for the court's decision. They've already moved a heavy-duty drill onto your property, Martha. They're 10 feet from the willow tree. The four-star general didn't look at the judge for permission this time. He turned to his MPs. Lock the building. Signal the strike team. We are going to Martha's house, and God help anyone standing in our way. The hunt for the random granny had just turned into a race for the most dangerous object on Earth. The tires of the blacked-out SUVs screamed as they tore out of the courthouse parking lot, led by General Reed's command vehicle. Inside, Martha Jenkins sat between the general and a communications officer who was bark-stripping orders into a headset. She wasn't trembling anymore. The moment the secret was out, the granny persona had dissolved, replaced by the cold, calculating focus of a woman who had spent 50 years preparing for a day she hoped would never come. Airspace is restricted, the general barked. I want a perimeter around that property 5 minutes ago. If anything larger than a bird crosses that fence line, take it down. But Martha was looking at the tablet screen on the officer's lap. The live satellite feed showed her modest home, but it looked like a war zone. 2 massive yellow excavators were already positioned near the ancient willow tree. Men in tactical vests, not construction workers, were offloading crates from a semi-truck. They aren't digging, Sam, Martha said, pointing at a specific piece of equipment on the screen. That's a thermal induction drill. They aren't looking for a grave. They're trying to stabilize the cylinder's field so they can lift it without triggering the pulse. To the U.S. market watching this, the stakes were now clear. This wasn't just about a house. It was about a doomsday technology that had been silent for half a century. As they neared the outskirts of Oak Ridge, the local police tried to intervene, but the MPs simply bypassed the roadblocks. The townspeople watched from their porches, confused and terrified, as a small army descended on the quietest street in town. They reached the property line just as the first drill bit hit the earth. The sound was a high-pitched whine that set every dog in the neighborhood barking. Go! 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 The strike team leaped from the SUVs, moving in a synchronized V formation. But the construction crew was ready. From the roof of Martha's own house, a sniper opened fire. A bullet sparked off the hood of the general's vehicle. Take cover, Reed yelled, pulling Martha behind the heavy engine block. The firefight was brief but violent. The mercenaries weren't just hired thugs. They were highly trained professionals, the kind of shadow PMCs that operate in the dark corners of the globe. They were using suppressed weapons and coordinated smoke grenades. Martha watched as her garden, the garden she had spent decades nurturing, was torn apart by gunfire. Her hydrangeas were shredded, her porch was splintered, but her eyes remained fixed on the willow tree. "They're too close," Martha whispered. She looked at the general. "If that drill hits the lead casing I installed in '92, it'll trigger a localized EMP. It'll fry every electronic device in a 10-mile radius, including your life support systems at the local hospital and the flight controls of those choppers above us." "We have to stop that drill," Reed said. He looked at his men, who were pinned down by the sniper on the roof. "We can't get a clear shot without hitting the house." Martha reached into her jacket and pulled out a small, rusted key that hung around her neck. "There's a cellar entrance disguised as a storm drain behind the shed. It leads directly to the subfloor. If I can get in there, I can manual override the security bolts and drop the cylinder another 50 feet into the bedrock. It'll be out of their reach forever." "It's too dangerous, Martha. You're not 24 anymore," Reed protested. Martha looked him in the eye, the same way she had in the desert in 1974. "And you aren't a captain anymore, Sam, but I'm still the only one who knows the code." Without waiting for a yes, Martha waited for the next burst of cover fire. As the MPs laid down a heavy spray of lead toward the roof, the 72-year-old ghost moved. She didn't run like a young soldier. She moved with the economy of a predator, staying low, utilizing the shadows of the hedges she had planted for exactly this purpose. She reached the shed, slid the key into a hidden slot in the floor, and vanished into the earth. Inside the tunnel, the air was cold and smelled of damp soil and ancient oil. Martha moved through the dark by memory. She reached a heavy steel door and punched in a 12-digit sequence. The door hissed open, revealing a room that looked like a 1970s laboratory. In the center, a massive lead-shielded shaft held the asset. Above her, she could hear the drill grinding closer. The vibration was shaking dust from the ceiling. Suddenly, the door behind her slammed open. It wasn't a mercenary, it was Marcus Thorne. He had a pistol in his hand, and his face was twisted with greed. "I knew you'd come here, Martha. My grandfather died in that desert trying to find this. He told me it was the key to infinite power. I'm not letting a clerk stand in the way of my family's legacy." Martha didn't look at the gun. She looked at the control panel. "Your grandfather didn't tell you the whole truth, Marcus. This isn't a power source. It's a map. And the people who sent it, they don't want it found." "Shut up and step away from the console," Thorne screamed. The drill above finally broke through the first layer of the ceiling. A spark of blue light arched across the room. The hum that Martha had heard in 1974 returned, louder and more terrifying than ever. The asset was waking up. Outside, General Reed saw the sky above the willow tree begin to shimmer with a strange, unnatural aurora. "Martha, get out of there, now!" he yelled into his radio. But there was no answer, only the sound of a single gunshot echoing from beneath the earth. The gunshot echoed through the narrow underground chamber, a sharp, deafening crack that seemed to momentarily stop the vibration of the drill. For a heartbeat, time stood still. Marcus Thorne stood with his arm outstretched, the smoke still curling from the barrel of his pistol. But his eyes weren't on Martha. They were wide with a sudden, paralyzing realization. Martha Jenkins hadn't fallen. She was leaning against the primary control console, her hand pressed against her side. The bullet had grazed her, tearing through the old military jacket, but it hadn't stopped her. More importantly, the bullet had missed her and struck the lead-shielded casing of the asset. A hairline fracture spiderwebbed across the black surface of the cylinder. "You fool!" Martha gasped, her voice strained as she fought the pain. "You didn't just break the seal, you started the countdown!" Suddenly, the low-frequency hum escalated into a piercing, melodic chime that resonated in the teeth of everyone within 3 miles. Above ground, the aurora that General Reed was watching intensified, turning from a soft blue to a blinding, pulsating gold. The mercenaries on the roof dropped their weapons, clutching their ears. The electronic optics on the military's rifles flickered and died. Every car engine in Oak Ridge stalled simultaneously. This was the pulse Martha had warned about, but it wasn't a weapon. It was a signal. General Reed, realizing the strike team was now effectively blind and without communications, did the only thing a leader could do. He ignored the sniper fire and ran toward the shed. "Martha, talk to me," he bellowed, throwing himself into the cellar entrance. Back in the chamber, the air had begun to glow. Thorne, terrified by the phenomenon he had unleashed, tried to run, but the door had automatically sealed under the emergency extraction protocol. He was trapped in the room with the woman he had mocked and the object he had coveted. "What is it?" Thorne screamed, cowering in the corner. "What is that thing?" Martha ignored him. Her fingers flew across the vintage 1970s switches, her mind moving through the 5W1H framework she had memorized 50 years ago. "It's a litmus test, Marcus," Martha said, her voice echoing with a strange multitonal quality caused by the cylinder's frequency. In 1974, we found it. The government wanted to use it as a weapon. They thought it was a power source from a rival nation, but I knew. I felt it when I touched it in the desert. It's a silent observer. It was buried here to see if humanity would eventually find it through curiosity or through greed. She looked at the fracture Thorne's bullet had caused. The gold light was leaking out like liquid fire. If the light reaches the surface, it triggers the reset. It tells whoever sent this that we are still a violent, primitive species that uses courtrooms to steal land and guns to steal secrets. It tells them we aren't worth the stars. General Reed burst into the room, his uniform torn and his face covered in soot. He stopped dead, looking at the glowing cylinder. "Martha, my God, it's open!" "Sam, get him out of here," Martha ordered, pointing at the shivering Thorne. "I have to initiate the silent protocol. I have to seal the fracture with the lead melt system." "The lead melt?" Reed's eyes widened. "Martha, that system is manual. You have to stay inside the shielding to pull the lever. The radiation, the heat, you won't survive it." Martha looked at the general. For a moment, the random granny disappeared, and the young special agent from 1974 Desert was back. She looked at the man whose life she had saved once before, and she smiled. It was a smile of peace, of a mission finally reaching its end. "I've had 50 years of tomatoes and hydrangeas, Sam," she said softly. "I've had a quiet life because you and the Pentagon kept my secret, but the secret was never just mine. It was ours. This land isn't mine. It belongs to the future." "Martha, no! There has to be another way!" Reed stepped forward, but the air between them had become a solid wall of ionized energy. "There is no other way, General. That's why I was the one who stayed. That's why it had to be a clerk in a small town." Martha reached for the heavy, rusted iron lever at the back of the chamber, the lever that would flood the room with molten lead, sealing the asset and herself forever. She looked up at the ceiling, through the dirt and the floorboards, imagining the willow tree one last time. She thought about the judge who had called her a fraud. She thought about the neighbors who didn't know her name. And she thought about the soldiers who had died in the desert so this object would stay hidden. "Tell the world," Martha whispered into the general's radio, knowing it might be the only thing that could transmit through the field. "Tell them that the random granny was just a soldier doing her job, and tell them to be better." As her hand gripped the lever, the golden light reached a crescendo, filling the courtroom, the town, and the sky above Oak Ridge with a brilliance that turned night into day. The golden light that had swallowed the town of Oak Ridge didn't end with an explosion. Instead, it vanished as quickly as a heartbeat, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt heavy. In the underground chamber, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and scorched metal. General Reed coughed, pushing himself up from the floor. The asset was gone, or rather it was encased. Martha had pulled the lever. A thick, cooling shell of lead now completely entombed the cylinder, sealing it back into the bedrock of the earth. But the room was empty. "Martha?" Reed's voice cracked. There was no body. There was no sign of a struggle. Only her worn military jacket lay on the floor near the lever, the silver star still pinned to the fabric, gleaming under the dim emergency lights. Martha Jenkins, the ghost of the 1974 desert, had finally lived up to her name. She had disappeared into the secret she had spent her life protecting. The aftermath was a whirlwind of high-level government intervention. Within an hour, the property was swarming with men in black from agencies that officially didn't exist. Marcus Thorne was led away in handcuffs, not by local police, but by federal agents on charges of treason and espionage. But the real drama returned to where it all began, the courtroom. 3 days later, Judge Miller sat on his bench, but he looked like a different man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a haunting, hollow look in his eyes. The courtroom was packed again, but this time the front row was filled with high-ranking military officers and the remaining members of the EOD Honor Unit, all in full dress uniform. General Reed stood at the podium where Martha had stood. He didn't have a lawyer. He had the truth. "Your Honor," Reed began, his voice echoing with a somber authority. "A few days ago, you told a woman to take off her medal. You called her a random granny and a fraud. Today, I am here to present the final entry in the record of Special Agent Martha Jenkins." He held up a document that was no longer redacted. The mission in 1974 wasn't just about a satellite. It was about ensuring that humanity didn't destroy itself with a power it wasn't ready to handle. Martha Jenkins didn't just save my life that day. She saved our future. She chose a life of poverty and silence so that a shopping mall wouldn't accidentally trigger a global reset. She was the most decorated soldier to never exist. Judge Miller looked down at his desk, his voice barely a whisper. "The court acknowledges its grave error. The property dispute is dismissed with prejudice. The land is hereby declared a national protected landmark to be maintained by the Department of Defense in perpetuity." The general nodded. "It's more than land now, Your Honor. It's a reminder. Martha Jenkins spent 50 years being random so we could be safe. She didn't wear that medal for us to see. She wore it so she would remember who she was." As the general walked out of the court, he passed the willow tree one last time. The house was being repaired, but the garden was gone, replaced by a simple black granite bench. On it, a small plaque was inscribed with only 4 words: "The ghost is watching." The legend of the random granny spread through the U.S. military like wildfire. It became the story told to every new recruit about the true meaning of silent service. Martha may have been erased from the official history books, but in the hearts of those who knew the truth, she was the greatest hero the world would never know. The 4-star general eventually retired, but every year on the anniversary of the desert mission, he returns to that small plot of land in Oak Ridge. He sits on the black bench, looks at the willow tree, and leaves a single lemon bar on the seat beside him, because even ghosts deserve to be remembered. Martha Jenkins proved that the most extraordinary heroes are often the ones sitting right next to us, hidden in plain sight. But her story raises a terrifying question. What else is buried beneath the quiet towns of America? If you believe Martha's sacrifice should never be forgotten, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the military's most classified legends. Watch this next video to see the secret mission that the 4-star general was actually talking about in Chapter 3, the one they said was impossible. And tell us in the comments, if you found a secret like Martha's, would you keep it for 50 years? Stay vigilant, and we'll see you in the next one.